The phone rang at 4:47 in the morning. Clara Pruitt knew before she even reached for it. You develop a sense for that when the air itself feels wrong before the news arrives to confirm it. She sat up in the dark, the flannel sheet still warm, the September wind pressing cold against the single-pane window of her dormitory room at Frostburg State University, and she listened. Her father's voice was thin, not broken. Dale Pruitt didn't break, but thin, like a wire stretched too far. "The bank came out," he said. "They're talking about the notes. Clara, they're talking about the note coming due. She was packed by 6. And she never went back. Let me tell you about a place most maps barely bother to name. Garrett County, Maryland, the westernmost county in the state, a corrugated landscape of Appalachian ridges and creek hollows that the Industrial Revolution largely forgot. By 1987, the county seat of Oakland had maybe 3,000 souls. The farms up on Backbone Mountain and along the Yoyogheny River drainage were the kind of farms that didn't make the agricultural magazines. No irrigation pivots, no GPS-guided combines. Just steep, rocky, stubborn ground that had been coaxing modest livings out of stubborn families for 200 years. The Pruitt place sat on 41 acres of slope and meadow off Bittinger Road, south of the small community of Accident. Yes, that's the real name of the town, and no, we don't have time to get into that right now. The farmhouse was a white clapboard two-story built in 1921, its porch sagging slightly to the east as if the mountain itself were slowly pulling it back. Behind it, the land climbed in terraces of fescue and wild clover toward a ridgeline of second-growth hardwoods, oak, tulip poplar, shagbark hickory, where in autumn the colors burned so hard you'd think the whole hillside had caught fire. The air up there in September smells of wet limestone and wood smoke and something else, something clean and sharp and ancient that doesn't have a proper name, only a feeling, the feeling of altitude, of being above the noise. It was into this landscape that Clara Pruitt returned in the fall of 1987, 19 years old, her junior year of college abandoned, her accounting textbook still in a cardboard box she'd shoved under the passenger seat of a 1979 Ford F-150 that burned a quart of oil every 300 miles. She came home because her father needed her. She stayed because the hillside told her something the classroom never had. Dale Pruitt was 53 years old in 1987, and he had the hands of a man who'd been arguing with rocky Appalachian soil his entire life. Wide, rope-veined, permanently stained with the particular brownish-orange of Garrett County clay. He'd inherited the farm from his own father in 1971, along with a modest beef cattle operation, 12 Angus cows, a bull named Senator, and a note at the First National Bank of Oakland for $38,000, which, in those days, had felt manageable. 16 years later, it was not manageable. The cattle market had hammered small producers through the 1980s. Consolidation pushed prices down. The big feedlots in Kansas and Nebraska could move beef at margins a 41-acre Maryland hillside farmer simply could not match. Dale had sold off cows year after year to service the debt, until by the fall of '87 he was down to 6 head, barely enough to call it a cattle operation at all, and owed $61,400 to First National, with a balloon payment looming in the spring of 1988 like a thunderhead building over the ridge. He hadn't told Clara how bad it was. He was that kind of man. The kind who figures his troubles are his own to carry, and that dragging his daughter home from college to witness his failure would be worse than the failure itself. But Clara found the papers on the kitchen table the morning after she arrived. She read them twice. Then she made a pot of coffee, sat down across from her father and said, "Daddy, I want to see the back pasture." Dale looked at her. "Why?" "Because," she said, "I've been reading about something." Now let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever met a person who sees a problem the way most people see a blank canvas? Not with dread, with possibility. Clara Pruitt was 19 years old. She had no agricultural degree, no business capital, no equipment. What she had was a mind that bent toward solutions the way a good vine bends toward light. And she had been reading about sheep. Every story like this one has a man who stands in the sun and casts a shadow over everyone else. In Garrett County in 1987, that man was Harlan Fitch. Harlan Fitch was the county's largest agricultural lender. officially the senior commercial loan officer at First National Bank of Oakland, but more practically the man who held the financial destiny of a dozen farm families in those hills. He was 61 years old, thick-necked, with a white mustache he kept immaculately trimmed, and a banker's habit of arriving everywhere in a suit that cost more than most farmers made in a month. He drove a 1986 Buick LeSabre the color of pewter, and he drove it slowly through farm country, the way a man drives when he knows the land is watching him and wants the land to know it's being watched back. Harlan Fitch had not grown up farming. He'd grown up in Cumberland, the son of a hardware store owner, and he'd come to banking the way some men come to power, by studying who had it and figuring out how to get close. He wasn't evil, let's be fair about that. He was a man of his era, which meant he believed in spreadsheets and proven commodities and models that had worked before. He believed in beef cattle. He believed in corn. He did not believe in anything a person hadn't already made money doing in Garrett County for the last 50 years. And he absolutely, categorically did not believe in sheep. In November of 1987, 2 months after Clara returned home, Harlan Fitch drove his pewter Buick up Bittinger Road and sat across from Dale and Clara Pruitt at that same kitchen table where Clara had read the loan papers. He set his briefcase on the table, genuine leather, monogrammed, and he spread out the refinancing terms. The bank would extend the note 18 months, he said, if Dale could demonstrate a viable path to income. Clara pushed a folder across the table toward him. It contained 4 months of research, photocopied articles from Sheep Magazine, from the University of Maryland Extension Service, from the National Sheep Improvement Program. It contained hand-drawn projected revenue models. It contained soil analysis she'd requested from the county extension office. Harlan Fitch put on his reading glasses. He looked at the folder for perhaps 45 seconds. Then he took his glasses off, folded them, set them on the table, and looked at Clara Pruitt the way a man looks at a well-meaning child who has just suggested something adorable and impractical. "Young lady," he said, and those 2 words carried more condescension than most men could fit in a paragraph. "This is Garrett County, Maryland, not New Zealand." He slid the folder back across the table. "Your father needs a cattle operation, or he needs to discuss sale of the property." Sheep, he paused, and the pause had the quality of a man deciding whether the idea was even worth finishing a sentence about. "Sheep don't pencil out up here. They never have." He picked up his briefcase. He left without finishing his coffee. Clara sat at that table for a long time after his Buick taillights disappeared down the road. Then she said, quietly, to her father, "He's wrong. Word travels fast in a county with 3,000 people and not much else to talk about." By the following week, it was known at Gortner's Hardware, at the Dairy Queen on Route 219, and in the break room at the Garrett County Farm Bureau Extension Office that Dale Pruitt's daughter had come home from college with some crazy idea about turning the family's failing beef operation into a sheep farm. The reactions ranged from doubtful to openly mocking. Ray Stemple, who ran 400 acres of corn and soybeans in the flatter ground near Grantsville and served on the Farm Bureau's Livestock Committee, said it loud enough in Gortner's one Saturday morning for 6 men to hear. "Girl quits college to play with sheep. Dale must be proud." There was laughter. Not mean laughter exactly, but the laughter of men who'd spent their lives in a landscape that punished bad decisions, and who'd learned to find humor in other people's bad decisions as a way of processing their own fears about making them. At the November Farm Bureau meeting in Oakland, Harlan Fitch, who attended as a non-voting member, the bank's representative to the agricultural community, mentioned in the context of a discussion about farm loan defaults that some operations in the county are pursuing what I'd call creative alternatives, and the way he said creative made the room smile without him having to say another word. Clara heard about it. She heard about all of it. Here's what she did about it. Nothing, not yet. She was busy. Because here's what those men in Gortner's Hardware didn't know. Here's what Harlan Fitch, with his leather briefcase and his monogrammed initials, didn't know. Here's what nobody in Garrett County, Maryland, paying attention to the wrong things, understood in the winter of 1987. Clara Pruitt had spent 4 months learning something that would change every calculation those men had made. Let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever watched someone work so quietly, so purposefully, that you almost missed the moment they became formidable? That's the thing about the people this channel loves to tell you about. They don't announce themselves, they just work. And Clara Pruitt worked like a woman who'd read the fine print on her family's future and decided she didn't accept the terms. To understand what Clara had figured out, you have to understand what was happening in American agriculture in the mid-1980s that most people, including most farmers, were not yet seeing clearly. The commodity markets were brutal. Beef, corn, soybeans, these were being produced at industrial scale, and the small producer was being squeezed from every direction. But there was another market, a quieter market, a market that the big consolidators hadn't gotten to yet because it required something they couldn't easily automate or scale. Quality. Specifically, fine fiber wool and specialty lamb. Clara had found her first clue in a back issue of Sheep magazine from 1985, sitting in the periodical stacks at Frostburg's library during her sophomore year, before any of this happened, before the phone call, before the morning with the loan papers. Something about it had stuck in her mind. She'd even kept the issue, folded into her accounting textbook. The article described the East Frisian sheep, a German dairy breed that produced both high butterfat milk and exceptional fleece. It described the Rambouillet, the fine wool breed developed from Spanish merinos that produced fleece valuable enough to command specialty premiums far above commodity wool prices. And it described something else, the Shepherd's Market Cooperative Program being piloted in Pennsylvania and West Virginia, connecting small producers of high-quality wool and lamb directly with specialty textile buyers and restaurants looking for local product. Clara spent the fall of 1987 not just reading. She drove to Mayersdale, Pennsylvania, 40 minutes north, and visited a Rambouillet operation. She drove to the University of Maryland's Agricultural Extension in College Park and sat with a livestock specialist named Dr. Thomas Weil, who spent 3 hours with her going over the numbers, which is the kind of thing that happens when a 19-year-old walks in with a folder of hand-drawn financial models and a look in her eyes that says, "I am not leaving without an answer." Here is what the numbers said when Clara ran them honestly against the Pruitt farm's specific conditions. The back 41 acres of the Pruitt place included 22 acres of rough hillside pasture, too steep and rocky for cattle to graze effectively, which was why Dale had never fully utilized it. Sheep, however, do not mind steep ground. Sheep, in fact, prefer it. They are browsers as well as grazers, and they can extract nutrition from marginal forage that would starve a cow. The back pasture, useless to Dale's Angus operation, was, for the right sheep, close to ideal. The capital costs for a starter flock were manageable. Rambouillet ewes ran $125 to $175 per head from reputable breeders in 1987. Fencing requirements were significant but achievable over a winter of work. The existing barn, a 1940s-era post and beam structure that had been used to winter cattle, could be adapted for sheep with minimal cost. The revenue model, when she projected it out 3 years at realistic production rates, showed a path to $28,000 to $34,000 in gross annual income from a flock of 60 ewes. Fine wool at specialty premiums of $4.50 to $6 per pound clean weight, plus lamb sales at $2.10 to $2.40 per pound live weight to the specialty restaurant market that was, in 1987, just beginning to emerge in cities like Washington, D.C. and Baltimore, 2.5 hours away by truck. Against the farm's restructured mortgage payments of approximately $8,400 per year, that wasn't just survival. That was a way out. But Clara had one more piece of knowledge, the piece that would matter most. In December of 1987, she borrowed $400 from her mother's savings account. Her mother, Margaret, worked the register at the Ace Hardware in Oakland 3 days a week, and had set that money aside for Clara's spring tuition, and she drove to a farm auction in Hardy County, West Virginia, where an old shepherd named Ernest Schiffelt was selling off his equipment. Ernest Schiffelt had run Rambouillet sheep on the West Virginia ridges for 31 years. He was 78 now, and his knees were finished. He stood in the cold of that December morning and watched his life's equipment get sold off piece by piece, and when Clara walked up and shook his hand and told him what she was trying to do, something in his expression shifted. He sold her what she most needed to buy, but more importantly, he spent 4 hours talking to her. What Ernest Schiffelt knew about Rambouillet sheep on Appalachian terrain was worth more than any textbook. He knew which parasites to watch for on wet limestone ground. He knew how to read a ewe's body condition at shearing. He knew the difference between a flock that produced good wool and a flock that produced exceptional wool, and the difference lived in the details: nutrition, timing, stress management, the way you handled the animals in the weeks before shearing. Clara wrote it all down, 12 pages of notebook paper, in the passenger seat of the oil-burning F-150 in the parking lot of a West Virginia auction house in the cold. She drove home in the dark, her $400 mostly spent. A 1963 Hinman hand-shearing table strapped in the bed of the truck, along with a rebuilt Sunbeam electric shearing unit, and a notebook full of knowledge that no bank officer in Garrett County could have understood even if he'd wanted to. Let me pause here and ask you something. How many times in history has the person who should have failed been the one person in the room who did the actual work of learning? How many times has the laughter of comfortable men been answered not with argument, but with preparation? Clara Pruitt wasn't arguing with Harlan Fitch. She was getting ready. The first lambs dropped in March of 1989. By then, Clara had spent 14 months building. The winter of 1987-88 was the fencing winter. She and Dale, working 6 days a week through a Garrett County cold that could freeze a water line solid by 9 in the morning, strung 3,100 feet of woven wire fence across the back pasture. The corners were set in concrete. The gates were hung true. The hillside that had been sitting there doing nothing for Dale's cattle, slowly getting reclaimed by brush at the edges, was now divided into 4 rotational paddocks that Clara had laid out based on Ernest Schiffelt's grazing rotation principles. In February of 1988, she drove to a certified Rambouillet breeder outside of Uniontown, Pennsylvania, a man named Harold Kessler, and paid $3,800 for 22 yearling ewes and 1 ram. She'd borrowed the money from her parents' restructured farm operating line, with Harlan Fitch's reluctant signature on the paperwork. The bank had agreed to the extension, though Fitch had made it clear he considered the sheep component of the plan highly speculative. The ewes were bred to lamb in late February and March. Clara slept in the barn for 3 weeks during lambing season, a practice she'd learned from Ernest Schiffelt, who believed that the first-year shepherd who doesn't sleep with his flock doesn't learn what a flock actually needs. 41 lambs born, 39 survived to weaning. Clara lost 1 to a difficult presentation and 1 to a ewe with insufficient milk. She wrote both losses in her notebook with the detail of a diagnostician, so she could learn from them so she could do better next time. By June of 1989, she had her first shearing. Now let me describe this moment to you the way it deserves to be described, because this is the moment that changed everything. Clara had been shearing practice animals since the previous fall. She'd borrowed an older Rambouillet wether from Kessler and spent 30 hours learning the technique from a cooperative extension video series, and from a professional shearer named Bill Orndorff, who worked the West Virginia and Maryland circuit and had agreed, for the cost of a home-cooked dinner, to spend a Saturday afternoon teaching her the Bowen method. On the morning of June 14, 1989, the sky over the Pruitt farm was that particular Appalachian blue that appears in early summer when the humidity hasn't yet arrived, sharp and deep and clean as cold water. Dale Pruitt sat on an overturned bucket near the barn door. Margaret had come out in her kitchen apron. Ernest Schiffelt had driven 3 hours from Hardy County, West Virginia, his knees protesting every mile, he said, because Clara had called him and he wasn't going to miss it. The Rambouillet ewe Clara brought in first was a big, quiet animal she'd named Tuesday. Clara tipped her onto her hindquarters, the way Bill Orndorff had taught her, the way that immobilized the animal without stress, and she began. The Sunbeam electric shearing unit hummed in the cool morning air. The fleece came off in one piece, one continuous unbroken skirt of creamy white fiber that curled and fell to the barn floor with a sound like a heavy sigh. 41 breeds of sheep produce 41 qualities of fleece, and what came off Tuesday that morning was what the specialty buyers called bright Rambouillet clean, fine, with a micron count in the high 18th range that put it firmly in the premium category. Ernest Schiffelt picked up a handful. He rubbed it between his fingers, that gesture of an old shepherd, reading fiber the way a printer reads type. He looked up. "Girl," he said, and he hadn't called her young lady with condescension. He'd called her girl with something that lived between admiration and relief, the feeling of watching something you cared about succeed. "You've got something here." By the end of that first shearing day, Clara had processed 22 ewes. The total clip raw weight before skirting and cleaning was 238 pounds. She had already been in contact since the previous winter with a specialty fiber buyer operating out of Frederick, Maryland, named Susan Aldrich Quinn, who sourced fine domestic wool for 3 small textile operations on the East Coast. Susan had told Clara, "Bring me Rambouillet Bright at 18 microns or finer, and I'll pay you $5.75 a pound clean weight." The clean yield on Rambouillet fleece runs approximately 65% of raw weight. Clara's math done on the back of a feed receipt while Ernest Schiffelt drank his third cup of coffee. 238 pounds raw, roughly 155 pounds clean at $5.75. $891 from one shearing from 22 sheep, from a hillside that Harlan Fitch had looked at and seen nothing. By 1990, the flock had grown to 47 ewes through retention of the best ewe lambs. Clara had added a secondary revenue stream, direct lamb sales to 2 Washington, D.C. restaurants, brokered through a connection she'd made at a Shepherd's Market cooperative meeting in Morgantown, West Virginia. The restaurants were paying $2.35 per pound live weight for certified natural-raised Appalachian lamb, with no antibiotics and no feedlot finishing. Clara's lambs went to market at 100 to 115 pounds, grass-finished on the Pruitt hillside. In 1990, gross farm revenue from the sheep operation was $22,400. In 1991, with the flock at 61 ewes and Clara's shearing and flock management skills now refined to a level that Ernest Schiffelt said he hadn't seen in a first-decade shepherd in 40 years of knowing shepherds, gross revenue was $31,700. The farm was paying its own way. And then Clara did the thing that nobody expected. She called Susan Aldrich Quinn in Frederick and she said, "I want to know if you'd be interested in processed roving." Roving, that's the intermediate product between raw fleece and finished yarn, fiber that's been cleaned, combed, and drawn into a soft rope ready for hand spinning. The specialty fiber craft market, which in the early 1990s was just beginning the growth that would eventually explode into what we now call the fiber arts movement, was paying $18 to $24 per pound for quality domestic Rambouillet roving processed from identifiable flocks. Clara bought a used Ashford drum carder and a Bond electric spinner from a retiring fiber artist in Frostburg for $340. She taught herself, from library books and one weekend workshop at a fiber arts cooperative in Elkins, West Virginia. She spent the winter of 1991-90 to processing 20 pounds of her premium clip into roving. The roving sold in 6 days, at $21 per pound. It was April of 1992 when Harlan Fitch drove his pewter Buick up Bittinger Road for the second time. He came for a routine check-in. That's what the bank called them, routine check-ins, though everyone understood they were wellness checks on loans the bank was worried about. The Pruitt note was one he'd been watching since 1987. He expected perhaps to find things marginally improved. He expected perhaps to discuss modified terms. He did not expect what he found. He came around the bend in the road, and the Pruitt farm opened up before him, and what he saw was not the tired, struggling operation of 5 years earlier. The fencing was immaculate. The hillside pasture was alive with the white moving shapes of 61 Rambouillet ewes and their lambs, spread across the 4 paddocks in a rotation that kept the forage fresh and the parasites managed. The old barn had been resited on 2 walls with lumber dale, had milled from timber thinned from the upper woodlot. There were raised garden beds along the south fence, Clara's addition, producing vegetables she sold at the Accident Community Market on Saturday mornings for a small but meaningful supplementary income. And in the kitchen where Clara met him, where she set out coffee and a folder of her own, the numbers were not in Harlan Fitch's briefcase this time. They were in Clara's. She opened the folder and walked him through it. Farm revenue for 1991, $31,700. Projected revenue for 1992 with the roving operation added, $38,000 to $42,000. Outstanding loan balance, $44,200. Projected payoff date at current trajectory, spring of 1994. Harlan Fitch sat across from Clara Pruitt, and he looked at the numbers for a long time. Dale Pruitt stood by the kitchen window, looking out at his hillside, saying nothing. "Here is what Fitch said finally," he said. "These are solid numbers." He didn't say he'd been wrong. Men like Harlan Fitch in 1992 in a small Maryland county did not say those words at that table to that young woman, but these are solid numbers from Harlan Fitch meant the same thing. He left without finishing his coffee again, but this time the air in the kitchen afterward felt different. It felt like something had been released. Clara looked at her father. Dale Pruitt, 58 years old, a man who'd spent his adult life arguing with this hillside and mostly losing, looked out at his sheep, his daughter's sheep, moving quietly in the spring light. He didn't say anything either. But he put his hand on her shoulder, and that said everything. On March 8, 1994, Clara Pruitt walked into the First National Bank of Oakland and made a final payment on the Pruitt farm mortgage. The total payoff figure was $41,880. She paid it with a cashier's check drawn on the farm's operating account at the same bank, a small irony that was not lost on her, and that she mentioned to exactly nobody, because she had learned, in the years since she came home, that the best victories are the quiet ones. The loan officer who processed the payoff was not Harlan Fitch. He had retired the previous year. The young woman behind the desk stamped the paperwork and said, "Congratulations, the property is clear," and Clara Pruitt nodded and said thank you and walked out into a cold March morning in Oakland, Maryland, and stood next to her truck for a moment in the parking lot. The F-150 was a different one now, a 1988 model, purchased used, that only burned oil every 500 miles. Small improvements, that's how it happens, not all at once. Slowly, the way a flock improves through careful breeding, or the way a hillside is reclaimed through patient management, one season at a time. Here is what happened in the years that followed. By 1995, the Pruitt operation was running 78 ewes, and had developed a waiting list of restaurants in the Washington-Baltimore corridor for their natural lamb. A waiting list, not a shortfall of customers. Clara had partnered with two other small operations in Garrett and Allegheny counties to create what they called the Backbone Mountain Sheep Cooperative, a direct marketing group that shared shearing and processing costs and presented a unified brand to buyers. The cooperative's combined gross revenue in its first year of operation, 1996, was $94,000 across 3 farms. By 1998, Clara had been invited to speak at the Maryland Sheep and Wool Festival in Howard County, an event that draws thousands of fiber artists, shepherds, and buyers from across the Mid-Atlantic. She stood at a podium and talked about rotational grazing on steep terrain for 45 minutes to a room that gave her a standing ovation. She was 29 years old. Ray Stemple, the man who'd laughed at Gortner's Hardware, actually approached her that year at the Garrett County Fair and said, with the stiff dignity of a man doing the right thing against his instincts, that he'd been wrong. He was thinking about adding a small sheep operation to his Grantsville acres and wanted to know if she'd be willing to talk. She was, because that's also who Clara Pruitt was. Dale Pruitt lived to see all of it. He died in 2003 at 69, of a heart attack that the doctor said had been building for years, the way such things do in men who work too hard and say too little about what hurts. But he died with the mortgage paid and the land clear and his daughter's ewes on the hillside and his name on the deed. He died, in other words, as the man he'd always wanted to be, a farmer on his own ground, beholden to no one. Margaret Pruitt still lives in the white clapboard farmhouse. She's 81 now, and she tends a kitchen garden along the south fence that yields more tomatoes than any 81-year-old has reasonable use for, which means the neighbors do well. Clara Pruitt went back to school eventually, not for accounting. She enrolled part-time in the University of Maryland's Animal Science program in the late 1990s, and completed her degree in 2001, 14 years after she left Frostburg with her textbooks in a cardboard box. Her thesis was on parasite management in small ruminant operations on Appalachian terrain, and it was cited in a USDA extension publication the following year. She farms the Pruitt place still. The flock is 104 ewes. The roving sells out every year at the Maryland Sheep and Wool Festival before lunch on the first day. She has a daughter named June who is 12 years old and already knows how to tip a ewe and red a fleece. The Backbone Mountain Sheep Cooperative has 10 member farms now. The hillside above Bittinger Road is still as steep and rocky as it always was. It is in the right hands enough. Let me tell you what I think about when I think about Clara Pruitt. I don't think about the mortgage payoff, though that's satisfying to know. I don't think about the standing ovation in Howard County, though she earned it completely. I don't even think primarily about the look on Harlan Fitch's face at that kitchen table in 1992, though I'll admit that's a pleasant image to sit with for a moment. What I think about is a 19-year-old girl sitting in the passenger seat of an oil-burning truck in a West Virginia auction house parking lot in December, writing down the knowledge of a 78-year-old shepherd in a cold notebook in the dark. That's the moment, that's where it was won. There is a kind of arrogance, and it is so common that we barely notice it anymore, that judges the value of knowledge by the credentials attached to it. Harlan Fitch looked at Clara Pruitt and saw a girl who had quit college. He looked at Dale Pruitt and saw a man who was failing. He looked at a rocky hillside and saw a liability. What he could not see, what his leather briefcase and his monogrammed glasses and his 40 years of approving and denying farm loans had made it genuinely impossible for him to see, was that knowledge doesn't care who carries it. Ernest Schifelt knew things about Appalachian sheep that no university had written down, because the knowledge lived in hands and eyes and the particular way cold morning light fell across a flock that only decades of attention can teach. Clara Pruitt had the wisdom to go find him, to sit with him, to write it down. That is an old lesson. It is, in some ways, the oldest lesson. The young and arrogant look at experience and see obsolescence. The wise young look at experience and see curriculum. And here is the other thing, the thing about patience, about what it means to build something slowly, without announcement, while the men at the hardware store are laughing. The Rambouillet ewe doesn't produce premium fleece because she was rushed. She produces it because she was well managed, well fed, handled with care, given clean pasture and time. There is no shortcut. There is only the work and the season and the next season and what you've learned in between. Clara Pruitt could not have paid off that mortgage in 1989 or 1990. The flock wasn't big enough. The skills weren't refined enough. The roving operation hadn't been imagined yet. She could have tried to do it faster and failed. Instead, she built it right. She built it so that when the payoff day came, it came sustainably, meaning she could keep building after it. That's what patience actually means when you strip away the greeting card version of the word. It doesn't mean waiting without action. It means acting without the need for immediate vindication. It means doing the work in the knowledge that the work is right and that the accounting will come, eventually, in its own time. Let me pause here and ask you one final question. What hillside do you have right now that you've been told isn't worth the work? What steep, rocky, inconvenient piece of possibility are you standing on that the Harlan Fitches in your life have decided doesn't pencil out? Because the thing about the Pruitt farm, the thing about every farm and every life in every story this channel tells, is that the people who turned impossible ground into something worth keeping were not the people with the most resources or the most credentials or the most confidence in their own rightness. They were the people who, when somebody told them no, went home and opened a notebook. They were the people who made the call. They were the people who, in the dark and the cold, wrote down what they needed to learn. For Dale Pruitt, who earned his ground. For Ernest Schifelt, who gave away his knowledge because that's what you do with knowledge worth having. And for Clara Pruitt, who drove home from a college dormitory in September 1987 and looked at a hillside that was losing and decided, quietly and without argument, that it was winning. She was right. Historical context is real. Garrett County, Maryland, the Maryland Sheep and Wool Festival, Rambouillet sheep, the East Frisian breed, the Shepherd's Market Cooperative Program, University of Maryland Extension Services, the Sunbeam Electric Shearing Unit, and the Bowen shearing method are all historically accurate. Characters, specific names, dialogue, and events are dramatized for storytelling purposes. All revenue figures are representative of documented market conditions for the period.